Hello, welcome to Baltic World, premier channel discussing news and important issues facing Northern, Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Crispin, and today I've got an article that's been brought to you by one of our viewers. So thank you, Gintaras, for forwarding this to me. A couple of quick housekeeping things. I bought myself a lavalier mic for my birthday so we could do more vlogging episodes. I am trialing it out here just as a one-off. I apologise, therefore, if the sound quality isn't as good as it usually is. The other thing is that this particular subject is to do with illegal drugs, and therefore YouTube in the comment section is likely to be quite censorious. So just bear in mind, I don't ever touch comments that aren't obvious spam, but just be mindful of YouTube's community guidelines when discussing this subject. Well, let's get into it. It's an article from Lithuania Radio and Television, and it's titled "Lithuania Moves to Decriminalise Possession of Drugs." The Lithuanian Parliament approved law amendments proposing to decriminalise possession of small quantities of drugs. 65 members of Parliament voted in favour of the amendments, 40 were against and 4 abstained. One more vote must take place before the changes come into force. The amendments aim to reinstate regulations that were in force until 2017, when liability for possession of small quantities of drugs without a purpose of distribution was provided for in the Code of Administrative Offences and not the Criminal Code. We'll just leave it there. It kind of is self-explanatory. If you have drugs for personal use, then it'll be treated more as a health issue. It is still illegal, and the fines, I think the article says, are between 50 and 350 euros, but it will not be treated as a criminal offence. Of course, if you do have large quantities of drugs, so likely that you're distributing and trafficking, you'll still be prosecuted under criminal codes. Now, in doing research for this report, I looked up the prevalence of drug use in Lithuania, and it is one of the lowest in Europe. And actually, this contrasts markedly from Estonia and Latvia, which have among the highest in Europe. Now, I'll need to do more research as to unpack exactly why that is. I have some theories, but still it is quite a dramatic difference. Only 4 in 1,000 Lithuanians, according to the research I could find, were drug users as covered by the definition. Now, this is also a significant contrast to Lithuania's alcohol consumption. Lithuania has the highest per capita alcohol consumption anywhere in the world. Now, Australians like to think they're big drinkers, but I think we're down, 11th or something like that. Whereas Lithuania is at the very, very top. So much so that new laws have been introduced. I think from 2018, the drinking age is now 20 and over. So keep that in mind if you're traveling to Lithuania and you're sort of 18, 19, going on a gap year. Be mindful that you will not be able to purchase alcohol in Lithuania because it's 20 and over. And also when I was there, you couldn't purchase alcohol in supermarkets and other kind of public convenience stores after 8 p.m. at night. I don't know if that is a standard law, but that was definitely a rule that I experienced when I was trying to purchase alcohol. So on the one hand, you have very high levels of alcohol consumption, but very low levels of drug use. So the question then becomes, is it a good idea to decriminalise illicit drugs? And my views on this philosophically are that certainly it's a good idea. If you think about the limited police resources that exist and you want police to focus their time and attention, investigative resources on major crime, violent crime, domestic violence, major fraud, theft, burglary, and of course, drug trafficking. Having them spend all their time arresting small-time criminals or treating people who perhaps have a marijuana addiction or a low-level drug addiction as a criminal is counterproductive. Most of these people are otherwise healthy, productive members of society. They just happen to have this habit, and therefore the most appropriate discussion for the state is between that individual and their doctor, not that individual and the law. I don't have a problem with mandatory diversion programs and things like that. So let's say they do come afoul of the law. especially if it's not specifically drug related. So sometimes people will enter crime in order to fund a particular drug habit as a significant motivator of crime. So people will start stealing or being fraudulent or building up kind of debts they can't pay because they have a drug problem which they are servicing. And I have no problem with the law saying you must go into these diversion programs as part of a rehabilitation in order to avoid incarceration and jail time. I think that is perfectly fine. And I think that would be a reasonable injunction for people pulled up with, let's say, more harmful types of narcotics under this legislation as well. The next question, and this is a vexing challenge for governments all around the world, is as you reduce the legal injunction against drugs, do you increase its prevalence? Does it proliferate throughout the society? And does it create a greater health concern overall? I mean, if you look at countries that are super strict on drugs, and I think of Southeast Asia, my part of the world, Singapore, Philippines, places like that, your penalties for even small amounts of drugs is extremely severe. But it does seem to be effective. People are deterred from acquiring drugs and therefore developing drug problems because of the enormity of the consequences of being prosecuted. At the same time, in Lithuania's case, I'm not as concerned about that because they did have a decriminalized regime prior to 2017, and so this is just a restoration of that previous set of laws. And because there wasn't a major drug problem in Lithuania prior to 2017, there is a logic to the position of saying it's not going to be a problem now. There will be some increase. It's inevitable. If you increase the availability and reduce the penalty, then the deterrent effect is reduced. But is it going to be so much as to increase Lithuania from being a very low drug using country to something a bit more moderate? I'd have to say at the moment, this doesn't appear to be the case. And if we do find an uptick in drug use, then they can always go back to the previous regime. I wouldn't recommend it as the first option, but it is an option that is available. And then the final question is philosophical. What is the role of the state in regulating individual behaviour? There are strong libertarians out there that will say that all drugs should be legalised. The role of the state is really to ensure quality and safety standards are met, and to fund the health services and support services that may be required through taxing the product. I.e., if the product is causing harm, you can tax it, and then that revenue is then spent on services for users. That is a perfectly consistent position, except I think back to the tobacco case. If you ask a teenager who's just starting out smoking whether or not they believe that they'll still be smoking in 12 months, 95% roughly will say, no, this is a temporary thing that they're doing at the moment, right? And yet, after 1 year, 95% of young people are still smoking. That is, that had they been aware of the likely consequences of their actions at the time that they started taking it up, they would be much less likely to have engaged in that in the first place. And with that knowledge, I do believe that there is some role for legal regulation when we know from mass data that on aggregate a particular substance or product is harmful. And so I think decriminalisation for personal use really strikes the balance correctly. You don't want to waste too much police resources chasing after people that otherwise live perfectly lawful lives, people that aren't actually hurting anybody else through their behaviour, and focus your legal resources on high-end, traffickers, producers, distributors, mafia, and the like. That is basically where I sit. So I commend Lithuania on getting to this position. I do think there should be ongoing monitoring, obviously, of the prevalence of drug use within the country to ensure that this doesn't result in a significant uptick. If it does, by all means, introduce stronger measures. It may not necessarily mean revocation to the previous regime of criminalisation. It might be other steps instead, but certainly I don't support necessarily like having widespread drug use, unfettered, open slather kind of legal processes on this. Ultimately, some level of regulation is appropriate, but not treating people who have issues, who should be treated with care and compassion, as criminals, because they generally are not. That's my view. Please let me know what you think down below in the comment section, mindful of the community standards. Do you believe that drugs should be legal no matter what, that this drives criminal elements out of business, that the government can collect the revenue that it otherwise forgoes, and that it means that the police and law enforcement resources can be better spent elsewhere? Or do you think that criminalising drugs reduces the prevalence to such a degree that it is beneficial for society as a whole, that we can do better without these particular things? It would be very interesting to see in a vacuum what the laws in Lithuania would be when it comes to alcohol, for example. So at the moment, they've already tightened the rules, as I said before. But if alcohol was completely illegal in Lithuania and you knew the consequences of making it legal, probably would leave it illegal perhaps. I don't know. It'd be a very interesting kind of thought exercise. So give us your opinions. Thank you very much for watching this. Do like and subscribe if you found value in this discussion. This is a subject applicable to every country. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much. Goodbye.